This podcast hopes to answer the question, is human behavior logical or emotional? Sometimes when I am writing a brief, a legal brief, I am analyzing facts, reviewing the law, and then applying the law to the facts. And sometimes no matter how much I tweak the logic in my writings, sometimes the conclusion that my client needs and requires seems to be impossible to obtain. The problem then might be in the initial facts and law. I will call the facts and law values and variables. The great thing about writing is that you can quickly go change those initial values and variables and make the legal brief arrive at the conclusion that you need to get something that works for the client. But when it comes to people and their behavior, that is entirely different. What I'm trying to talk about here is what is deterministic and what is non-deterministic. When it comes to writing a computer code, you have to put in the right computer language to get the outcome that you want. In order to write a legal brief that works for your client, you have to look at the facts, you have to look at the case law, you have to look at the statutes, and you have to apply it in the correct way to get that outcome for your client. See, those are things that are deterministic. So, I believe human behavior is non-deterministic. Unlike what I mentioned earlier, writing a computer code is deterministic. The values and inputs drive the outcome. There is no emotion in the computer code. And, well, hopefully not too much emotion in my briefs either. Everything is, you see, deterministic. But this rule does not apply to human behavior. We're just not logical animals. We are emotional animals. So I have come to believe that human behavior is a complex calculus of emotion, personality, circumstances, and deep-rooted beliefs that may evolve over time. Now, what's interesting is, emotion, personality, circumstances, all these beliefs, they can evolve over time. But I can't say that logic evolves over time. If I'm wrong, let me know down in the comments, please. Okay, so moving on. Human behavior is much more dominated by emotions than logic. And that's with large regard to different brain regions. You have the amygdala, for example. That's the part of the brain that's the fight or flight response. Determines if it looks for threats, and then it puts the brain into fight or flight mode. So you're not really thinking logically anymore. You're just very emotional, and it's about survival. Whereas the prefrontal cortex, that's in the frontal lobe of the brain. That's like the brakes of the brain. That's the part that tells you, hey, whoa, let's not do this. Let's think logically. So the problem is the emotional areas of the brain, like the amygdala, kind of overtake the prefrontal cortex, the logical part of the brain, and now you've got the emotional part of your brain in the driver's seat and hopefully not doing things that you're going to regret later, or saying something dumb or hurtful that you're going to regret later. And without going too much on a rabbit trail, I will say that drugs and alcohol do help the emotional areas of the brain to overtake the prefrontal cortex. So that's why people who are under the influence of drugs or alcohol, they might do things out of anger or emotion and not so much out of logic. And yes, it is possible for the brain to completely shut down the logical regions of the brain in very high-stakes situations. This is because logic does not exist separately from the emotional regions, but it is an outgrowth of them. Thus, we will never be logical, or we can only be logical when emotions are not present. This is why people are, quote, blinded by love, quote, lashing out in anger, quote, driven by lust, or, quote, addicted. People who are more logical generally avoid emotional ups and downs because there is literally no way to control yourself after a certain point. Most people, including many persons who are more linear thinkers like scientists, believe human beings to be irrational. Especially as a family law attorney, I do divorces and domestic violence. I see a lot of people not acting out of logic. Trust me. Personally, I disagree that people are irrational, and I'll explain why. It's very interesting. However, I also see that it's a matter of perspective. So here are the two perspectives as I see them so you can decide for yourself. Okay, so we have the human behavior is illogical argument, and then we have the human behavior is logical argument. So let's first look at the illogical. This argument is based on the premise that we live in a physical world that can be objectively measured, and it is our behavior that changes without any seemingly rational reasons. For instance, we tend to cherry pick information that supports our beliefs while ignoring all data to the contrary. For example, most people tend to focus on either the good or the bad things that Trump has done, depending on how they feel about him. We often act against our own self-interest, for example, through addictions, bad habits, staying up late, etc. Our actions can be inconsistent and unpredictable. We don't always act the same way in a similar situation or react differently to the same information. We tend to judge a decision based on the outcome rather than on the information we used in making the decision. For example, we might have won money at the casino, but that doesn't make gambling a smart decision. The list of our cognitive biases goes on forever, and it makes for a very compelling case. So why would I disagree with it? Here's why. Okay, let's talk about the human behavior is logical argument. Contrary to what most people believe, we don't actually live in an objective reality because we have the ability to feel feelings and the ability to sense the outside world through our five senses. It was perhaps inevitable that we should confuse the two and overlook the true source of our experience. Our minds are that source, and each of us lives in a separate one. This doesn't mean that we see the same thing differently, but rather we are creating our worlds from within. For instance, you and I might both point at the background picture I used on this podcast video and agree that it is indeed of a clock, the gears in a clock. But what we can never know is how similar or different our experience of those clock gears were. Perhaps I experience it one way, it makes me happy. You experience it as something that makes you, sad. There's really no way to know. What this points to is that we are all living in completely separate realities. Furthermore, each of our realities are constantly in flux. Because our thinking that is creating our realities is constantly ebbing and flowing, our experiences of the outside world is constantly changing too. Said another way, our reality is constantly changing before our eyes. Yes, the chair looks like the same chair and Sam looks like Sam, but our experience of them are constantly changing. One moment the chair is just a chair, and next it's a holy place of momentary rest and relaxation. One moment Sam is a fun, exciting friend, and the next moment he is an annoying, selfish pain in the ass. What I am getting at is that our realities are 100% from within, and they are constantly changing. What might look like logical behavior to the outside world is actually 100% logical in relation to what our world looks like in the moment. We are all doing the best that we can given our thinking in the moment. That is what makes us logical people in that respect. That is all of us at all times. So to come back to the question whether humans act logically or not, it depends on what you believe the source of our reality to be. If you believe that the physical world of form is the real world, then human behavior is illogical. However, if you see that the physical world is simply the thin skeleton upon which our minds create our experience, and that experience is constantly ebbing and flowing, then it follows that each person is behaving 100% consistently given what looks real to them. For the first 40 years of my life, I was in a quote-unquote humans are illogical side of the argument. But based on what I have learned in the 2 years since, I no longer think this to be true. And I can't imagine ever going back. We are all living in the filling of our thinking and not in the filling of the world. I welcome you to look in that direction. You'll be amazed when you see it. And in the words of Alan Watts, the world of form and illusion, which the majority take to be the real world, is none other than the play of the Spirit. Thank you for listening. Please consider subscribing.